This is Jennifer Say. She's from Allentown, Pennsylvania, attends Central Catholic High there, and she's preparing to work the balance beam.
Jennifer just recently won our national championships to become our national champion. That was a flange position she held and then went into a front walkover. Straddle jump, very difficult move because you can't see the balance beam.
I hate that move. You used to do that in competition, Kathy, and every time you got to that part of your routine, I went, oh my gosh.
Oh, it's not that bad. 2 back handsprings into a layout somersault. She doesn't quite have the solid landings that we saw with the Soviets. She's actually moving quite well. Front mounter. As you can see, she's checking her balance just a little here and there. She needs a little more extension in her toe point to be absolutely perfect. Walkover, back handspring swing down. Tiny bit off, but not bad. Dismount, double twist. One little step. It's a pretty good exercise, but there are several deductions in there.
She's 17 years of age. Jennifer Say from the United States.
Here's 2 back handsprings. Nice layout somersault.
Jennifer Say of the United States, her score 9.25. We're in the second rotation, and we'll be back with more in just a moment.
All right, so everybody that's listening, if you're listening to us on one of the 20 radio stations, we appreciate that. Y'all listening to Fire Breathing Rob. If you're listening to us on YouTube, you know, depending on the day, is if that's going to go on or not, because we have been censored lately, covering COVID-19, covering vaccine injury. We appreciate if you're listening on there, if it makes it. We have a special guest. I'm really enthusiastic about this interview because I've listened to quite a few interviews that she's done, and we were both on the same side of the aisle. I don't know where she is, and she's going to tell us in just a few moments, but I've changed due to COVID-19, vaccine injury, and many other issues that I feel like we were hoodwinked, bamboozled, lied to, whatever word you want to say. This is Jennifer Say, and I'm going to run through this, Jennifer, because you have a lot of things you've done. So I'm going to try to just read this off the computer so I can get this correctly. She's an author, a filmmaker, a business executive, a gymnast, also the 1986 national champion. She was on the U.S. women's national team. She produced Athlete A. It's about Larry Nassar and all that craziness through the U.S. women's gymnastic team. She's also was the chief marketing officer and brand president of Levi's until her vocal opposition in San Francisco of the public school shutdown. And she also wrote a book. It's about Levi's Unbuttoned, the woke mob took my job but gave me my voice. That was a mouthful, Jennifer, but thanks for sticking with me on that. And I appreciate you coming on and talking to our listeners wherever they're listening to us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's kick this around. You started at Levi's in '99 and moved up the ladder a little bit. You were there, I believe, 23-ish years. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this. But
oh, that's right.
Okay, very good. So 23 years, you were next in line to be CEO of the company. And then let's start off with what happened there.
Yeah, I worked my way all the way up from basically the bottom. But in 2020, right from the outset, in March of 2020, I was very outspoken about the closures of San Francisco's public schools and the public schools nationally, but I lived in San Francisco at the time. Right. You know, literally from the beginning. I mean, I didn't miss a beat. I thought it was wrong from the beginning. I thought the data was clear and available from the beginning, that children were at little to no risk. Schools were safer than outside of schools. This was always true. The data was always available. And I was outspoken on social media. I wrote op-eds. I ultimately, when the conversation started to change, appeared on local news programs as well as national news programs, went to school board meetings. I did all of it. I wasn't just tweeting, although that's sometimes what the headlines read. And about 6 months into my questioning, I got my first call. No one said anything for a full 6 months. I don't know if they didn't notice or what. But I got my first call from a peer who leads corporate communications, and she told me, people don't like this. They don't like what you're saying. I said, so it doesn't matter. Her own children were in in-person private school, and she was telling me I couldn't advocate for public school students. And my children were in public school, but it wasn't just about my children. My children had it pretty good. They had a nice place to do their work from, strong Wi-Fi, all that. It was still hard for them, and nothing can kind of address the isolation that comes from at-home schooling or virtual Zoom school or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, that first conversation ended with me saying, basically, no, thank you. I don't want to stop. And then the calls came every 2 weeks for the next year and a half, until ultimately I was told there wasn't a place for me at the company any longer. And rather than accept their severance to keep me quiet, I publicly resigned.
Well, you are a hero for doing what you're doing, and we're probably not going to get into the gymnastics thing. I do want to hopefully have you on again to discuss that, what you produced with Athlete A, and just, but we'll have to do that another time, because we want to dive deep into the book here. I want to talk about that. I went to school at private school during my, grammar school and my high school. I get it. There's a lot of money there. With that said, as you stated, most of the private schools opened back up fairly quickly, very fast, compared to the public schools that were closed for a year in some states in the country, or even more than that in in the same states. Yeah. So with that said, is this a class issue here where, we keep the poor and the middle class kids in the school, out of schools rather, excuse me, and keep them at home, which these kids are suffering from child abuse in some places because the parents are at home, and, obviously it was a stressful time. These kids also, due to not being in the schools, they're not getting that free and reduced lunch, which you stated 50% of kids in San Francisco are in the public schools, and they're in the impoverished kids. So they're not getting lunch or, breakfast in general. Mental health issues. They have no Wi-Fi, or very, the Wi-Fi is very low key as far as that goes. So it's the rich can do whatever the hell they want because they got the kids in the Catholic schools or the private schools in general. And the people that don't, if you have money, you're in good shape. If you don't, it's like, screw you, who cares?
Yeah, exactly. In many instances, these children, if they were older, meaning 10, 11, 12, they were left at home alone to take care of younger siblings. How were they supposed to do schoolwork, even if they tried, in the conditions that you just described? It absolutely is a class issue. And I was a traitor to my class, in a sense, for standing up for the children and for just simply sending my children to public school. I could have afforded private school, but I was a traitor for calling out this hypocrisy. You aren't supposed to denigrate your own. And I did. Every single one of my peers was sending their kids to in-person private. Well, let me just be clear, in the summer of 2020, disavowing their privilege, because that's when all the protests were happening, the BLM rallies, and everybody was pledging to end racism and denounce their own racism. But the children in public schools are disproportionately low income, Black and brown, and those are the kids that were being harmed from these policies. So wealthy children were able to further their education, participate in sports, and children without means and resources were left to fend for themselves. And now, of course, we see this playing out. The harms have been egregious in terms of learning loss. Test scores are at like a 30-year low. These children in public schools weren't permitted to play sports for even after the schools opened. Many cities didn't allow sports for public school children. These are kids who depend on college scholarships. in sports to go to college. And yet the wealthy kids kept playing sports. And guess where the scholarships went?
Yeah.
The wealthy kids. So, in every way, we just abandoned our responsibility to these children for an equal opportunity at an education. And it is class. But I would also argue the reason the public schools stayed closed, at least one of the reasons I would put at the very top of the list, is the teachers unions. And this is an organization that I had always typically, and I'm interested to talk about where you were versus where you are now, I had typically defended and stood by, and I do not any longer. And I think, the teachers unions at every turn were intransigent and refused to go back. Even in the spring of 21, they butted to the front of the line for vaccines, which maybe that's not a good thing for them. But the reason they were moved to the front of the line is it was conditional that then they would go back. And then they got to the front of the line and they still refused to go back. So, I think for the unions, it was also an assertion of class privilege in a sense, because these teachers, while not particularly highly paid, were not going to go back before white collar office workers went back. And in some places like San Francisco, those white collar office workers are still not in the office. It has the lowest return to occupancy rate of any city in the country. So, I think they were drawing a line in the sand and saying, whether they knew that was what was driving it or not, they were like, we're like these white collar workers. We're not going back like the essential workers, the garbage collectors, and the people that work at Safeway. We are staying home with the white collar workers, with the office workers. We are not putting ourselves at risk. So I think that also was an assertion of class.
Jennifer, I want to talk about this because I was like you, as I stated earlier on in the interview, I was a Bernie Sanders person. I know you were Elizabeth Warren person, but it's coming from that same faction, yeah. That progressive faction of the Democratic Party. With that said, after all you've been through with people calling you, I call it the verbal diarrhea, the racist, they'll call you a sexist even if you're a woman, misogynist even if you're a woman. It doesn't matter. You regurgitate the same words. Yep. Do you feel like it was, and it still is, a cult-like atmosphere? And because that's where I'm feeling like it was, it was and still is, and that they just make their own rules. And if you don't agree with the cult, they will call you the verbal diarrhea, every word in the book. And they will, they'll ruin your family. I was told they even went after your husband too. And I mean, what the hell does he have to do with any of this?
Yeah, he has nothing to do with it. I didn't know you couldn't work in a company if you disagreed with your husband, or even agreed but didn't say it on some matters. It's insane. Yes, they are about party, not principle. They are about ideology, not truth. There is no sort of belief that objective truth exists. They'll, twist any sort of truth into knots to further an ideology. And that's what left me, and I'm sure you as well, so astonished, is I believed in what I thought were the principles of the Democratic Party. I believed in classical liberal principles. I do still believe in free speech. I believe in public education. I believe in, equal opportunity, equality of opportunity, not equity, and equal outcome. And I was heartbroken to find that they didn't mean it at all, that they were all about party, not principle. And that's what makes it cult-like. And, the other aspect that makes it cult-like is what you described. They will call you any name in the book, any ad hominem attack, when they can't meet your argument with true discussion and debate. And, for a time when I was being called these names, everything from, QAnon, alt-right, psychopath to racist, even though my two older children are mixed race, for a time, I tried to defend myself rationally against these allegations, which you cannot do because they're not rational and they're not grounded in truth. So I then started to ignore them and just kind of continue with trying to be rational while being diplomatic and data-based in the discussion. And I thought that, I focused my efforts on children because I thought children that was a subject we could all agree on, that we don't actually want to harm children, but apparently not, because again, party and ideology trumped any sort of protection of children or truth, really, in the end.
Well, I'm grateful that throughout this time of the past 3 years, I've kind of, I would say, opened up my mind and saw the light. If we want to go into religious terms with that, I really did see the light. And I think what these people want is like, it's like we said about the cultish behavior. But my problem with them is that, like I have a lot of friends that are Trump supporters. I don't like the guy, but we can have a civil conversation about this. Throughout 2020, people lost their minds, and there was so much fear instilled in our society, whether it was vaccines, whether it was if you go outside, if you don't wear 1, 2, 3 masks, you're going to drop dead in 10 seconds. You're going to go to the hospital and die. The average age for a COVID death was 80 years old. They never said that.
No.
Kids can't really get infected. They can get infected, but it's really not going to hurt
sick.
them. All these things came out later on, which they knew ahead of time. Yeah. But they never discussed them. And people lost their critical thinking skills and say, let's look at this logically and kind of take the fear out of it. If I'm a healthy human being and I work out consistently and I'm 30 some odd years old, I'm 33, but regardless of that, whether you're 40, 50, if you're working out hard and you don't have any comorbidities, you don't really need the vaccine. You can just, make sure you're eating correctly, make sure you're working out. I knew there was an issue when they started shutting down the gyms. And, anytime when this is as a country that's almost 50% obese and they're starting to shut down the gyms, then there's something there. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah. I mean, in San Francisco, where I lived, and, the deep blue cities and the deep blue states were the worst, as you know, the playgrounds were closed for 9 months. Children had nowhere to play, run around, get exercise, get sunshine, all things that we know are protective from poor outcomes from COVID. They shut down basketball courts. They actually removed the hoops so kids couldn't play, or they put boards over them. They filled skate parks with sand. They closed beaches. People were arrested for surfing. Like, can you think of a thing that's like safer than surfing? You're like by yourself out in the ocean.
I remember in California, just to interrupt you, I remember in California, they had somebody on the news. This may have been way back in March or April of 2020. There was a guy out there surfing by himself and they arrested him because he didn't have a mask on. How the hell can you surf?
Well, you actually weren't allowed to surf. So you could get arrested just for actually surfing, mask or no mask. And this happened in Santa Clara County, which is a little bit south of San Francisco. Now, during the same time, in the late spring, golf courses opened. So again, you want to talk about a class issue. Who's playing golf?
Yeah.
Right? Older, wealthy people. But kids who depend on outdoor basketball courts to get exercise and to socialize and, all of it, all the things that we know are good for our physical and mental health, they were barred from doing so. And they had to stay home in often tiny, cramped apartments with many, many people, which is like the worst place they could have been. There was nothing about it that made sense from the very beginning. And as you state, the data was clear from the very beginning. The median age of death coming out of Italy was 82. It was very clear. But again, this became the policy of the left, essentially. This became woke policy, why we can debate all day. But your adherence to this policy was a symbol of your commitment to the party, but also you got to wrap yourself in virtue and consider yourself a good person. And even though all manner of cruelty was justified by being said good person. And when I talk about cruelty, I mean keeping poor kids out of school. I mean allowing old folks to die alone, women to give birth alone. I mean, these are such incredibly abhorrent, cruel policies. And yet somehow the people that vociferously advocated them felt like the good ones. How on earth does that happen? But what became clear to me, and I think this is part of the wool being kind of, lifted from my eyes, is that the majority of people would rather stand with the group and wrap themselves in fake virtue than actually stand up and do what's right, and possibly have to stand apart in doing so. They just would. Most people, probably 60 to 70% of people, would rather do that. And now, even after we see all these catastrophic impacts unfold right before our eyes, especially as it pertains to children, many people on the far left, they still defend these horrible policies, or they defend the intent. Well, it might not have been the right thing, but it was the fog of war and we did the wrong thing, but it was for the right reasons. So that they're still the good people. Whereas you crazy anti-lockdowners, which they equate to being, Republican, you were doing it for the wrong reasons. All you care about is money and the economy and all these things. And guess what? You know what? A healthy economy without this crazy inflation, allowing working class folks to actually go to work and earn money and a living for their family, that is about the health and well-being of people. It always was. It was never just about money. You can't shut down the world's economy and think there won't be catastrophic impacts.
Well, we even go back to the money that was given to people that, hit that stimulus with as far as, only a certain amount of people could get it. I think it was like 2,000, and then there was like 1,600 with the last two combined together, something to that effect. Regardless of that, who is that? Who's, especially in San Francisco where you are,
who's getting
by?
Is
that going to help? How can you get by even with the rent? Just the rent, never mind the food, any kind of insurance. You can't do it. So it was all a total joke and a scam. And the money was going to, with the PPP loans and all these people that were extremely well off. And they were making out like bandits. They still are. And the people that were doing all the service jobs, as you stated, Jen, can I call you Jen or Jennifer?
Yeah, it was fine. Jen's good. No, Jen's good.
Sorry, it just flows out. I got the verbal diarrhea too.
No, it's fine.
So anyways, with that, Jen, then they're screwed. Because they don't, they're not able to work because their work is shut down, and the list goes on and on.
And just the idea, the very notion that this whole system was predicated upon, that some people are essential and others are not, is so grotesque that, people can be classified into essential and non-essential. And to your point, what these folks needed was to be able to work and support their families. And big business, businesses failed in this regard. They didn't, not a single, my company included, advocated for getting back to work so that employees could stay employed. Instead, we sent them checks one after the next, which were not enough to get them through, and subsequently caused the situation we're in now, which is outsized inflation, which is, the long tail of that is incredibly harmful to folks who are living paycheck to paycheck. It's also arguably responsible for the bank failures we've seen. Now, it's like on and on and on. And anybody that was clear-headed from the beginning knew that this was going to happen. We knew.
I want to get back into your situation. For people that are just tuning in, again, Jennifer say the book is Levi's Unbuttoned. The woke mob took my job, but gave me my voice. Definitely, it's a good read for sure. And listen, I know we have a lot of liberals listening, and we do, Jennifer, for you. I know you're just coming on. This is the first time, but a lot of millennials, a lot of liberals listening, and we hope that you just give this a chance. This is not a conservative interview. Everybody knows I'm not a conservative. I play it more so independent, and you are not either, Jennifer. You voted for Elizabeth Warren, as we stated earlier on in the interview. But we can differ on opinions. And again, put your critical thinking hats on, again, America, and just let's talk about this in a reasonable manner so we can kind of, get to the bottom of this and we can make better decisions, God forbid, if they ever try to pull this stunt again. Let's move into this because
that's the crux of the problem. And, in my advocacy for children, what I became increasingly alarmed about was the way that consent was being manufactured by silencing any voices of dissent. And if you don't have open debate and dissent, you cannot reach truth. You can't. And then the lies become fake truth, and that becomes policy. And we don't live in a democracy. We live in an authoritarian society where the government's just deciding what is true. So for me, that was just what was so alarming as this fight, continued for over 2 years. And it's why I wouldn't take the money and walk away and just be quiet, because it just felt too hypocritical.
Yeah, and for people that don't know, they wanted to shut Jennifer up and make her sign that non-disclosure. She didn't accept that, and she quit on her own. Again, get the book, read about that. It's very important that you read about this situation, because this is a person that stood up her whole life, not just in the gymnastics area, but also in this area as far as COVID-19 and fighting for her kids, but not even just her kids, for America's kids. And that's what's the most important. We need more people like you to say, hey, listen, I used to be a liberal, but I stood up to these people because they were not even in, when we go back to the liberal doctrine that you talked to about caring about people, about equality, about helping people, these people weren't even following their own doctrine. So, again, it goes
they don't
back,
believe in it. They don't believe in it.
It goes back to the cultish atmosphere. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah. No, they don't actually believe in it. And I think that's where the sort of scales fall from your eyes. And it's probably what you experienced is I felt like I believed in those values. I still believe in those values. I haven't actually changed.
Right.
You're the liars and the hypocrites. So, I just continue to fight and advocate for the things that I always did. Free speech, open debate, equality of opportunity. And yeah, I feel sort of stupid that I didn't realize it sooner, in fact.
Yeah, I'm with you. Oh, we see Dr. Fauci and these other government people that are in charge, Randy Weingarten, the leader of the teachers union. She's saying that they're saying they didn't push the shutdowns. Then they say they are. Then they say, like you said, oh, it was for the greater good. It's all a lot of nonsensical word salad in plain English. And they're just trying to play tricks with your head to, it's almost like double negatives. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, the gaslighting right now is off the charts. Just in the last week alone, Randy Weingarten said she fought for schools to open the entire time. She did not. Fauci says he had nothing to do with it. He was happy to be the face of public health. And granted, he didn't actually, pull the button or flip the switch that closed the schools, but he gave cover to the local school districts, governors, mayors, et cetera, across the country to do so, because he positioned children as super spreaders and schools as death traps, which was never the case. They're both now saying they had nothing to do with it. So, clearly their disavowal and repositioning themselves as an acknowledgement that the policies were catastrophic, right? Otherwise, they'd be proud to own them. But the fact that I was pushed out of my job, that alone is proof that they did take this stance. Because if I was just standing up and agreeing with them, I don't think I would have been pushed out of the company.
Well, Jennifer, nothing worked. Nothing worked. The lockdowns didn't work for the kids, for the regular people. The vaccines don't work. Nothing works. So they have nothing to bring to the table and chant and say, we did this. I go back to not one of my favorite presidents, but he did somewhat of a good job in this and bringing the country together. 9/11, George W. Bush. Not a fan of him, but at least he can say that he brought the country together. Whether it was Trump, Fauci, none of these people brought the country together. They brought it farther apart. And this was a big pharma giveaway. And it was, these senators made big money off these stock trades. There has been big talk about that throughout the past couple of years. It was a giveaway to big pharma and the rich and powerful in the country. And America fell for the fear because we didn't put our critical thinking skills up there and think about that. They were playing this game with us, and they'll play it again because they know they can get away with it.
Yeah.
Because you just instill fear in people, and
they'll do anything.
Yeah, and they'll do anything. Yeah. They'll take 25 vaccines. They'll.
It's true. I mean, on the one hand, when I'm feeling sort of like generous, I will say, okay, fear was, the world was blanketed with fear instilling statements. So, if you considered yourself an informed person because you watched CNN and read the New York Times, which I did. I just happened to also go further than that in in the 2 years of, intense COVID. But they thought of themselves informed. There were death tickers. I mean, the New York Times printed a death whatever graph every day. The CNN had a ticker of cases and deaths every day. I mean, imagine if every day when you turn on the TV now, there was a death ticker for car accidents or for whatever. You would live in fear all the time unless you said, wait a minute, this is nonsense. I need to look into this. Or unless you just sort of rejected fear as a way to live your life. And, I would argue all of this, whether it worked or not, was wrong and deeply unethical. It didn't work. The only way out was through, was just to kind of get through it together. But it's wrong regardless. I mean, the CDC's pre-pandemic playbook said schools never should close for more than a couple of weeks, even for a disease with a much higher fatality rate than COVID. And yet here we found ourselves with a year and a half of disrupted schooling for close to 25 million public school students. That's insane. It's a moral abomination. Even if it worked, I would argue it's wrong.
I want to go back to your story. When we go back to Levi's, with that said, was there a majority of people at the company that were going after you? I know there was a person that was looking through your Twitter feed and giving it to the CEO. I mean, that's kind of disgusting in general. You got to be pretty hot up to do that to somebody. Was it the majority or was it a small minority?
I think it was a minority. It was definitely not a majority, but it doesn't matter. We give the mic and the platform and the stage to the most vocal and punitive minority. Unfortunately, some of those people were my peers, and they were running to my boss, the CEO, with a dossier of my tweets, and he doesn't understand how that works, and they make him afraid that I am going to damage the company's reputation. I mean, I should state, our stock, we had a tough time during the closures because, of course, our schools were closed. We came out gangbusters because of the strength of the brand, which is what I led. So all their prognostications about how I was going to harm the business were complete hogwash. I mean, it was false. We were doing great, but they kept telling him, and they would say, look at this tweet, and somebody retweeted it. Who cares? And then you had a small minority of employees writing emails to him and the head of HR, and they got hysterical, and they weren't thinking logically or rationally. And then you had a tiny little minority of low follower accounts trolling me and, saying hashtag boycott Levi's. You had 50 ex-gymnasts who had followed me because of my advocacy within gymnastics, who started some sort of petition on Reddit to fire me. But we're talking tiny, tiny numbers. And again, the business was doing great. So none of the sort of predictions were playing themselves out. Ignore it and get back to work. And I think there was a very simple solution, which was for the CEO to stand up in front of the company virtually, of course, because we didn't go in the office, and just say, Jen's using her voice like we always advocate and tell people to do. She's doing it outside of work. You should feel free to do the same. Now let's get back to work. I don't want to talk about this anymore. But instead, I was accused of being all sorts of unemployable things. I was accused of being a racist, a conspiracy theorist,
there we go.
anti-union, which is like, well, yeah, now I actually am. I was told I needed to confess or pledge that I was one of us, not one of them. I mean, I had to do this in a virtual apology tour.
That's what it is.
Do it.
It's sad, Jen, because it's all about the us versus them. I was watching a meeting from one of my advisors back in college, because he's big with the Democratic Party in Florida. I went to college in South Florida, Boca Raton. And he does a lot of talks. And I was just for kicks watching one of his old talks from 2022. And the woman at the end, it was an elderly woman, she says, "Go blue." And I'm thinking to myself, that's the problem with the country. It's that it's not a sports game. This is not basketball or football. It's not go red, go blue. It's go America. And, these people think that this is some sort of a sporting event. And that's where it goes to the verbal diarrhea, like you said, racist, anti-Semitic, a sexist, misogynist. They don't even know what the words mean. They just repeat the words. You could ask them, well, define what that means. And I told people this before, is you keep calling people a racist. And once you start calling everybody a racist, the real racist, that means nothing because everybody is a racist. So you can't distinguish who's the racist, who's the not, who's the misogynist, who's not, sexist, not. So it's just a joke. And that's the way our country is now. And it's really sad.
It is, but people have to get to where you and I got to, which is to ignore the name calling. You have to just ignore the name calling because it's not grounded in any truth. It's the purview of people who have no argument. They're trying to shut you up. At a certain point, they knew, for instance, they wouldn't shut me up, but it kept everyone else quiet. Because I think you asked, was it a majority of employees? I think it was a tiny minority. And then I think there were a lot of people that didn't care. They just
Do you think there was
really
people though?
care.
Do you think there was people? Sorry to interrupt. Do you think there was people at Levi's that were on your side?
Probably.
And they wanted to stand up with you, but they were afraid to because they'd lose their job too. But
yes. But think about it. If all the people with common sense, or even the people that just believe in freedom of speech and open debate and dissent, even, you know, just to learn something, if all those people stood up and said, either one, I agree with her, or I don't agree, but I want to hear what she has to say, or I don't agree, but she has a right to say it, that would be the majority. If we
but Jennifer, isn't it a judgment call that you've been with that company for 23 years? I'm sure a lot of these people went up the ladder with you, or even if they haven't went up the ladder with you, they've worked with you. They know your judgment, that you have good judgment, that you wouldn't have moved up to that position if you didn't have good judgment. And they totally, again, didn't put up their critical thinking skills there and say, we trust Jen. We know her. We know she's not a racist, anti-Semitic person. We know that she has good judgment.
That's the part that's hurtful. I don't care about, you know, trolls on Twitter. These are people I don't know. They don't even have the courage to use their own name. But when people that you worked with for over 20 years, people who you worked either side by side with, or people who worked for you, but you helped kind of enable a career path for them. People whose baby showers I went to, weddings I went to, people who know what's in my heart and know the arc of my life, when they either fail to kind of stand up for you or actually demean and degrade you through name calling, that is what is really hurtful. And I will say, to this day, even though I've been able to kind of brush off some of the insults, that still makes me emotional. It's still really hard.
Have you got any apologies by these people that stood against you that said, hey, maybe like we were wrong at this time, but we kind of saw the light. We don't fully agree with you, but we see where you're coming from? No. No one. Zero.
No.
Wow. That's pretty bad, but okay.
Yeah, zero. Literally.
You would think you were working with some intelligent people that said after 3 years, we kind of see where she's coming from. Maybe we don't agree with her 100%. Maybe some people have saw the light. I don't understand it, because I do know people that have kind of saw the light, and I've met them through this journey. Go ahead.
But one of the things I get, which maybe you get as well, is, okay, fine. I mean, I don't get it from anyone from Levi's because they don't reach out to me or talk to me. I do get from friends or former friends, okay, you were right, but why did you have to say it? You know, like, why did why did this matter to you? Why was this the hill you had to die on? You had this great career.
Because your kids were in the same predicament as these other kids. They were in those schools that were locked down. They had learning loss. They might have had, you know, better internet. Maybe they were better financially than some of these other kids, but they still suffered the same consequences as the other kids that didn't have it so well. So it's still an issue. And my thing was, the 3 people in San Francisco, and I know this happened, that were recalled by the school district, you know, that should tell these people something, that something was wrong there. Go ahead.
Well, so the interesting thing, and just to make clear what actually happened, is the school board in San Francisco, it's an elected body, it's not appointed by the mayor, and 3 of the senior members of the San Francisco school board were recalled on February 15th, 2022, which was the day after I publicly resigned, curiously enough. And they were recalled by such a large margin. It was like 70 to 75% of the, mostly parents that were voting in San Francisco, they voted in this special election recall. Everyone I knew, even at Levi's, voted to recall them. Why were they recalled? They were recalled because they failed to get the schools open, and they focused on all sorts of stupid navel-gazing issues like renaming schools that were considered racist, like eliminating testing requirements, like, changing entry requirements for an academic magnet school called Lowell. These are the things I called into the school board meetings, like every week. They would go on 8 or 9 hours, and they wouldn't talk about getting the schools open at all until like the last 15 minutes. Parents who wanted schools open were again called racist. If you wrote in questions ahead of time or during, which I always did, of course, they were never addressed or answered. But ultimately, the San Francisco voters came through and they recalled these people, which to me means most people did agree with what I was advocating for, but they were too afraid to do so publicly. They did it at the ballot box.
Jennifer say, again, the book is Levi's Unbuttoned. The Woke Mob Took My Job but Gave Me My Voice. I want to get into this audience question. You went on Laura Ingraham. There was some backlash after that. Do you feel like, again, it's that Democrat-Republican game? It's you're not on my team anymore, and I'm going to just hammer you away. Do you feel like the Laura Ingraham thing, going on her show, rather, I should say, was the last straw, and that straw that broke the camel's back for these people at Levi's to just really hammer away at you hard?
It certainly was an instigating factor. I lasted a full year after I went on, and I stand by having gone on. I mean, I didn't watch Ingraham. I knew sort of vaguely what she thought about things. I wasn't a Fox News viewer, but she offered me a national platform, and I consulted with open schools moms across the country, and we knew that there could be backlash, but that it was important because no one would give us a voice. We tried to get on CNN. All they wanted to do was have on Fauci and Weingarten to talk about how all the children would die if schools opened. And so I took it. And you know what? Ingraham was really great on this issue. I think she was the first national news personality to speak out against lockdowns and school closures. I think she started in April 2020. She was the first one. So I'm happy to go on her show, and I'm happy to disagree or agree with her on anything. And I would do it again. And, I would say what I said again, and I would say it to her. But yes, that enraged people. And it was an indication to them that I was a wolf in sheep's clothing. And in fact, when I was asked to do this apology tour in the summer of 21, I was told I needed to address that question specifically because it was proof that I was one of them, not one of us. It was like a litmus test.
Talk about that apology tour. They wanted you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on, all the nits and crannies of this. They wanted you to go on some sort of Zoom meeting and apologize and kind of almost like bow down to them like they're the pharaoh, and you're like the peasant, and just say, I'm wrong. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned.
Right.
Something like that.
Right. Something like that.
And I know you said you didn't want to do that, and you didn't do that. So talk about what did happen through that Zoom meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I could have said no. I did not say no. I felt like I had sort of faith in my ability to explain myself and build bridges. I was, I guess, wrong about that, but I had faith. And I also just felt like, look, I'm a leader. I'm a very prominent, one of the top 3 leaders in this company. If they've lost trust in me, if employees have lost trust in me, it's my obligation to try to build that back. I'm not going to apologize because I haven't done anything wrong. And we all know when people prostrate themselves and try to kind of regain favor when they've done nothing wrong, they just get beaten down more. So I certainly was not going to do that. But I explained who I was and my history of advocating for children within sport, and I explained my views. Because keep in mind, when I did this apology tour, so-called apology tour, it was June of 2021. Schools had been closed for 18 months. And at that moment in time, there was no indication they were actually going to open in the fall of 21. So sentiment was changing a little bit in San Francisco. There was a little more openness, but I just explained, and it was already clear the harms that were happening. And I explained why I, accepted the invitation to go on Laura Ingraham. I explained why I was out there rallying in defense of public school children. And, you know, it actually went pretty well. I was asked one question about my husband and his views. You raised that earlier, which I just dismissed summarily. I said, he doesn't work here. Why does it even matter what he thinks?
But how did they know about your husband regardless?
He was active on social media. And of course, they all sort of hate followed him to see what he was saying. And he has a more kind of aggressive tone than I have. And he was very outspoken about the vaccines and mandates being unethical, and even very early on about how ineffective the vaccines were, which was, you know,
he was right on target.
He was right on target, and he had led anti-lockdown rallies in San Francisco. And they hated him. You know, he was a heretic, and I was married to him. So, you know, I was guilty by association.
How do we get to these people? Because they're still living in our society. They're living in our communities. They could be our friends, our family members, our neighbors. And to win the argument, so this doesn't happen again, we have to get to these people in some sort of way, shape, or form. You know, maybe you've got to some of these people. How can we do that? Because we need to start this up.
I mean, I think it takes all manner of resistance. You know, my husband, like I said, is much more aggressive, and he would probably rather kind of yell at somebody. He wouldn't, well, maybe he would. He would yell into the void. I still believe, and I just am a different person, that you continue to try to have reasoned conversations, and perhaps you bring people along bit by bit. There are some people that are dug in, their whole identity is wrapped up in it. They are never going, they're not reachable. But the vast majority of people are. And I actually think what I tell people is every day you have to push back on the crazy. You can't just accept it. You can't accept lies as truth and think that's harmless. You have to. You don't have to blow up your life, but every day you have to. Maybe it's have a conversation with someone that perhaps you can bring around. If your school has ludicrous policies still, I mean, there are schools in America that still require student masking. Like,
and they still have vaccine mandates in some of these colleges. By the way,
you have to resist. You have to say no, because if you don't say anything, they think you agree. It's the consent of the governed. So, you know, you just have to, and you have to defend your neighbor's right to push back and to dissent, even if you don't agree with them. And so that's what I think it is. That's what I try to do every day in my, you know, in my life, is have those hard conversations, bring people along just a little bit, make them think a little differently. Look, I want to just use an analogy to my gymnastics advocacy. You know, for those that aren't aware, I wrote a book in 2008 about the abusive culture, coaching culture in gymnastics, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, dragged across the internet for 10 years. Every gymnast I knew, well, not everyone, but 90% of the gymnasts I knew called me a liar and a grifter. People I knew had endured the same training regimen I had. I knew they knew it was true. But, you know, the thing to do was to uphold the power structure, you know, which is dependent on this idea of shiny, happy little girls dancing around. That's what brings in the money and the medals. And so I was a horrible, evil grifter for bringing this up, that young girls were actually suffering. Well, in 2018, Larry Nassar, the doctor of Team USA, who was a serial pedophile, went to prison for life. He had abused young gymnasts for 30 years. Suddenly, everybody came to my defense. Not only my defense, but they pretended they'd always stood with me. So all of those people who screamed and called me horrible names, they came around. It took 10 years.
Right.
And the most horrific pedophile in American sport being exposed, but they did come around. So I just have to believe that it's possible to bring people around, and that eventually those same people who want to stand with the group to feel virtuous, the group is going to have moved. And so they're going to want to stand with the other group, which is school closures were ineffective and harmful, and it can never happen again. They need to stand with that group.
I agree with you 100%. I'll tell you, that's really incredible that these young women suffered the same fate as you, as far as Larry Nassar, but they just didn't agree with you, or what was the case there?
I sort of violated some pact, you know, and this pact, and what we wanted to believe about ourselves was it was this amazing time in our life, and we won all these medals, and sure, we may have suffered from I mean, I suffered for years coming out of the sport because of the
Yeah.
emotional cruelty and physical abuse. But it's easier in a sense to kind of push that aside and believe in this fantasy, just like people want to believe in the fantasy that keeping schools closed saved millions of lives. Keeping schools closed, masking outside, none of these things saved a single life. But the alternative is so horrific that we harmed a generation of children that people will stand by the lie.
Yeah.
They
Well,
will. And it was the same in the sport.
we have to remember this too. There's people that are really still brainwashed. I've saw, and I believe this to be true, on Twitter and Facebook. There's people that got tattoos of their Pfizer vaccine number.
Yeah.
There's people that still with, I mean, we talk about mentally ill. I mean, you got to go there with that. There's people that still, the mask was almost like some sort of identity, that if you're not wearing the mask, symbol is a better word. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Is, if you're not wearing the mask, again, we go to the verbal diarrhea of all the name calling. And it was some sort of, people would put that in their Twitter bios, their
Their
everything.
picture was masked. It was next, a picture of themselves masked, a Ukraine flag, thrice vaxxed, like, BLM, she, her, these are all the accoutrements of saying I am a good person without really actually doing anything at all. Let's also remember that most people just don't want to do anything at all.
So how do we defeat the woke mob? You mentioned all the things that the woke mob are involved in. The pronouns, the transgender stuff has really come up, especially when this is a whole different topic for another time. And I want to be gracious with your time with the transgenders in women's sports. We'll have to do that when we talk about the gymnastics, hopefully next time. Obviously the COVID vaccine, the mask, the fear instilled in Americans throughout this time and still being instilled with Biden and his group. How do we defeat these people? Because it's hard. And they'll go after your career as they did with you. They'll go after your livelihood in general, whether it's career or money in general. Well, they'll take you down.
They will. And believe me, it's not easy to be unemployed. It's not easy to have not accepted that $1 million severance, but I would rather be free to speak my mind and unemployed than, have that job and be a conformist coward that doesn't actually speak the truth that's right in front of her face. I think, we just have to encourage others to join this fight with us. And the fact is, these woke policies are failing. Look at what is going on in San Francisco right now. Whole Foods had to close. Nordstrom's just closed their stores because the theft and the violence in these stores is too great. Employees are being attacked. I mean, they're killing this once great city. Harm reduction didn't work. There are people dying on the streets from drug overdoses. There are mentally ill homeless people that are harming the good citizens of San Francisco. I'm not saying this to dehumanize those folks. It's dehumanizing to allow them to live that way. These people need help. It's horrible. But the policy of harm reduction, the policy of, favoring language around the person is houseless, not homeless, because somehow that's mean to say they're homeless. It's like, this does nothing. And the city, 7% of San Franciscans left the city in over 20 and 21. That's a huge number that's destroying the city's tax base. Like, the people are voting with their feet. And of course, the people that left are higher income earners, right? This is horrible. My point, though, is it's the woke policy around crime and homelessness and drug addiction and drug use that is ruining that city. So these policies don't work. They're failing right in front of our eyes. Eventually, it's going to be unavoidable. So how does it end? That's how it's going to end, sadly. But that said, I think if you and I and people like us, especially people that come from the left, I think it does have some meaning, continue to speak out. People screw their courage up a little. There's a lot of people who sit by and think all this is crazy. There are a lot of people that think it's insane that Leah Thomas should be able to compete in women's swimming and, beat by a long shot women that are a foot shorter than her, who had won every competition up until that point. But they won't say anything because they think it's mean and they're afraid they're being called names. Well, it isn't kind to further a lie. It's not. And I just won't concede to this worldview that is premised on a lie. You can't do it.
Well, where are all the feminists? All woman
I'd
power. They're gone. They disappeared. We need a woman president. All these Hillary Clinton people against Donald Trump during 2016. We need a woman president. Hillary. These people all disappeared.
I love your accent. Well, that is
Yes.
because of woke ideology, because the ideology says there's a hierarchy of oppression, and women are lower on that list. They have more privilege. You know, transgender athletes are higher on the list of victimhood, and so that's
Now
why.
they're trying
That's
to
where
put them. Now they're trying to put these. I call them men dressed up as women, and in women's prisons. There was just
well,
a
they
case.
are.
Yeah,
They
and so
are.
what's going to happen to the woman in prison? They're going to get raped by men. So they're
Yeah,
not going to
it's
get raped
interesting.
by women anymore. They're going to get raped by men and women.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
the issue you just talked about, the broader issue is like, how do we protect women's spaces, which were created for a good reason. Women's sports were created in 1972 and protected by Title IX so that women had an equal playing field to compete and have educational opportunities that come with that. Women's prisons, same thing. We've never had mixed gendered prisons. Abuse shelters, all of these places are at risk because of this nonsensical ideology. But the feminists won't stand up. Well, it's not fair to say, because there are old school feminists who have been fighting this for the last 10 years. And in the UK, the prison issue is really central to the debate. But there are a lot of old school feminists who have fought this. But the new younger ones, nope, they're all on board with giving up their own rights, essentially.
We'll end here. I just want people to follow you. Where can they do that? Where can they get the book? Just tell us all that jazz before we end the interview, Jen.
Yeah, I'm most active on Twitter, the scene of the crime and my ultimate ousting. And that's just my name. My last name is SEY. I write a Substack also under my name, muse on a lot of these topics. And then the book is Levi's Unbuttoned. You can get it on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. Those are the best places.
Jennifer Say, thank you so much for your time. It's honestly a pleasure. I've been following you for quite a while since I heard you on Jimmy Dore. That was about 4 or 5 months ago. And it's really great to have you on. Thanks so much for doing this. And I really hope we can do this again to talk more about the gymnastics realm and also about this transgender nonsense with sports.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the sports issue. Right before I got on the phone with you, I talked with a woman from Icons, and they're working to protect women's sports. And it's very important to me. I was the beneficiary of these Title IX policies. That's what's so frustrating, is where are all my Gen X peers who also benefited from Title IX, and millennial peers who benefited from Title IX? Do they not understand that the inevitable outcome of this situation is there are no women's sports? That it's just, there's no categories, and then women don't have those opportunities anymore. But they don't seem to understand how this will inevitably play out if women don't speak up.
I got my COVID-19 vaccination, and here's why. This isn't about gimmicks or sentiment or what commercial I like. This is about facts. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective. Millions of doses have already been given in the United States, and these vaccines have the most intensive safety monitoring in U.S. history. People from different races, ages, genders, and ethnicities participated in large clinical trials around the world to make sure this vaccine worked for all kinds of people. The amount of time and effort dedicated to developing these vaccines was huge. Scientists used existing research and technology so they could get the vaccines developed quickly and safely without skipping any steps. If you need any more information, use a reliable source like the CDC website to get the facts.
I'm getting vaccinated against COVID-19. Yes, there could be some short-term side effects from the vaccine, but they go away in a day or two. Those are signs that my body's building protection. It's worth it to avoid serious problems from COVID-19 disease.